everyone, we are back. Don't worry, my co-star and lovely daughter Luna is on her way. But I figured while we were waiting for her, it would just be some us time, you know? Just you and me reading the rest of the letters that have been released for 3020. Now I know. Some of you out there might be like, what? I thought we already read the letters for 3020. And I would be like, same. But don't fret. There are more letters and a new chapter, which we will be reading and releasing as soon as possible. You know why? Because we are T-minus 7 days. We are in the last week stretch for camp, you guys. I'm excited, and I'm not even going to camp, except for if and when they host the days when parents and families can go to camp, because I will be in there, as my sister would say, like swimwear. Don't judge. It's been her go-to slogan since 2014. Anywho, I digress. Alright, let's get into this. December 1st, 2040. Entry log number 1256. Items, personal letter, and photograph. Location found, Tranquil Lake. Items were scanned and saved to archives. December 1st, 2040. Dear Nadia, I'm not sure if you will ever read this, but my heart hopes this letter finds you somehow. This picture was of our last Thanksgiving. I can't believe it was really our last. I hope that wherever you are now, you will find friendship and a reason to gather and be thankful like we did for so many years. I am sorry your mother couldn't be there with us. I am sorry for everything you had to endure. But Nadia, I am so proud of you, of your courage against everything we faced together. Your strength is what kept me going. You will be okay, Nadia. I am sure of it. You are a survivor. Remember that Daddy loves you. Dad. Aww. The feels, you guys. The feels. The next letter. June 13th, 2041. Entry log number 1598. Item, personal letter. Location found, Tranquil Lake. Item was scanned and saved to archives. June 13th, 2041. Dear Nadia, I am sorry I haven't written you for almost a year. I have been busy staying alive, hoping to see you again. I realize I never will. In the year that has passed, I have come across fewer and fewer humans. Only one in the past 2 months. He died a day later, shot by a sentinel. It was too late to save him. I fear that I am the only one left in this world. I can no longer hide and do nothing. Today I will do something. If I am to die, I will do so fighting, because I know that is what you would do too. I have spent the last year gathering enough scrap metal and supplies. I will leave them here in this cave and hope you find it someday. How? I don't know. But you have always been a smart girl. I only have one set of explosives left, and I will use them to take down enough of the GDI with me. Don't think of me as a coward, Nadia, but the sooner I do this, the sooner I can be with your mom, to wait for you just like we always did every year when you returned from camp. I love you, Dad. You guys! These letters. Ah! Hello. You guys can see. Yes, my co-host is back. She's got her pew-pew weapon in her hand.
Yeah.
And she's got her camp outfit.
Yeah.
Alright, so we're picking up with the newest chapter that was released. Chapter 11, Nadia. Bum, bum, bum. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Nadia opened her eyes and immediately realized where she was. She held her breath and struggled to break loose from wires that were attached to her. It was like being caught inside a net that had been stuffed in a tube. Feeling her lungs starting to burn, the desire to gulp for air growing stronger, she began panicking, punching and kicking the glass in a frantic attempt to break out. She could not hold her breath any longer, and her movements started to slow down, her arms and legs feeling heavy, her chest feeling like it was being crushed. A mild, incessant beep, beep, sounded in the dimly lit lab, and just as Nadia started to pass out, the glass around her shattered, and she felt herself fall, landing hard on the ground as fluid from the cryotube she had been sleeping in showered down on her. Instantly she rolled over on her side and began coughing. With effort she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees and retched loudly, coughing and spitting out whatever liquid that she had swallowed. When the retching, coughing spasm subsided, Nadia slumped over on her side and lay there for a long moment, eyes closed, gasping and drawing in huge gulps of air, trying to catch her breath. Eventually, the aching in her chest gave way to the pleasure of being able to breathe freely. Still lying there, the girl opened her eyes and felt a jolt of fear shoot through her. Two huge steel feet were standing on the concrete ground a few inches in front of her face. Steel feet that were attached to legs. Her fear at seeing that quickly turned to panic as she recalled what those feet and legs belonged to. She tried to get up, knew she needed to do so, needed to run, but was too weak. Congratulations! You are awake. Your stats are stable. You are suffering from high levels of fear, which is understandable, as well as suffering from the effects of long cryosleep, a deep male-sounding yet robotic voice said. Nadia rolled over on her back, rubbed her eyes, and then gasped aloud. A sentinel was standing there, looking down at her, its head tilted to one side, the odd V-like face outlined with blue light. But it wasn't attacking her. Why? Slowly, worried about what might happen, she tried to stand up, but was weak and went down on her knees. Careful, the sentinel said in its unusual robotic voice. The girl frowned at that, wondering why a sentinel would care if she was careful or not, or if she got hurt or not. She glanced up at it as she struggled to get to her feet. As soon as she did, a wave of dizziness overtook her, and she stumbled slightly, and then her legs went limp, and she ended up going down on her knees again. Oddly, the huge sentinel took a slight step toward her, holding out a hand as if to help her. Still not sure what to think, the girl just knelt there studying the giant robot. It didn't seem as if it wanted to harm her. If it did, she would be dead already. After another moment ticked by, Nadia slowly reached out and took the machine's arm, allowing it to help her stand.
What are you? Why are you helping me?
Nadia was confused by the robot's actions. I am a special paramedic automated robot knowledge system. I am here to help you through this time of adjustment, the robot explained with a tilt of its head. I am programmed to keep you safe while you and others are in cryosleep, and through transitioning after you have woken up. Nadia said nothing to that. Confused, she just stood there.
You're a sentinel.
The girl said in a nervous voice. No, I am Automated Robot Knowledge System, the sentinel replied. I was programmed by Dr. Wu, him and that lady with the glasses who always is carrying around a logbook.
Huh?
Nadia grunted, still not fully understanding.
Doctor who? Wu?
Yes, the robot answered. He programmed me to look after all the chosen while they were in stasis and assist all of you when you woke up. Well, that explained some, although she wasn't sure how. From what she could recall, it was supposed to be impossible to reprogram a sentinel, which meant that either Dr. Wu had figured out a way to reprogram one, or he had built this thing from scratch and then programmed it. She knew that it must have been there all this time. watching over them and keeping them safe, so she assumed she might be able to trust it. Maybe.
Well, I'm Nadia. It's nice to meet you. Sparks. That's what I will call you. I'm not calling you all that stuff. That big name thing you just said.
Nadia chuckled, forgetting for a moment about her present situation.
I never remember all of that.
Very well. If that's easier for you to remember, might I suggest you rest? Sparks stepped to the side and motioned to a row of cots just some distance behind him, lit by a dim overhead light. You have been asleep for a number of years, and it will take some time to fully regain your strength. Nadia pursed her lips out and frowned, thoughtful as she glanced from the giant robot to the cots and back again. She wasn't sure about the sentinel yet, but at the same time she still felt weak and a little dizzy. After a moment she straightened up and slowly walked over to sit on the nearest cot, looking around at the area as she did so. The air in here felt cool, she suddenly realized, and smelled a little musty, like a room that had been locked up for a long time. When she lifted her left hand up and looked at her palm, she saw that it was covered with a good
Ah,
amount of dust. Frowning, she looked back up at Sparks, asking,
how long have I been asleep? What's happened? Where's my dad?
Sparks, who had been programmed to help the children through their transition, started to explain the history of all that happened. This might be difficult for you to hear, and I would have rather waited until you were stronger, more awake,
What happened?
Nadia persisted. If Sparks had been a living person with emotions, his shoulders would have slumped, and he might have sighed. Actually, Nadia thought she had seen the sentinel do just that. Do you know what the term nuclear fallout means? Nadia did somewhat.
Bombs?
Shortly after you and the other chosen were put into cryosleep, Sparks explained. Actually, on the same day, the machines who were at war with, well, everyone else, caused a nuclear fallout. Nadia felt numb terror filling up inside her at hearing that. Her father, her Uncle Mason, she heard herself blurt out.
How?
But it sounded as if another girl had asked that, and not her. Very easy, Sparks replied. They hacked into at least one country, perhaps the former country we are now living in, took over their nuclear arsenal and systems, and launched the missiles. Once the first nuclear strike was initiated, it quickly escalated, the end result being, well, not good for the world beyond this chamber. Nadia felt tears welling up in her eyes.
You mean a nuclear war? There's a nuclear war?
Sparks tilted his head to the side as he looked down at the girl. I'm afraid so, Nadia. One started by the machines in order to annihilate all human life. She began to cry.
Everyone is dead?
Sparks took a long moment to answer. Yes, everyone beyond this chamber, as far as I can tell. My scanning system has not detected any sign of human life for 321 years.
What?
Nadia was shocked to hear what the robot had said.
You said what? How long?
321 years, Sparks repeated.
Stop!
Nadia shouted, feeling dizzy and confused over all of that. Have I said something wrong? I believe my internal clock is working properly. Ignoring that, Nadia said,
300 years? I thought we were only supposed to be frozen for like 20 years or something like that.
Originally, that was the idea, Sparks confirmed. However, shortly after you were all in the cryopods, Dr. Wu was informed that the nuclear war had started, so he reset the timer and date for all of you to wake in 1,000 years. He then left, locking the chamber door behind him, leaving you all in my care, and most likely he died in the fallout from the nuclear bombs. Nadia felt saddened and horrified and shocked by it all. She lowered her head and started sobbing harder as she thought about her father, her uncle, and the world that was now gone. I knew this would upset you, Sparks said, and again seemed to sigh. Perhaps I can do something to cheer you up? Would you like to hear music? I can sing for you. Nadia frowned and looked up at the robot. Was he serious? Dr. Wu left detailed files for me to analyze while you all were in cryosleep, Sparks explained. Everything from classical literature to pop culture. He believed analyzing these things would help me relate to all of you better once you all awoke, and for all of you to feel more comfortable with me. I could sing you the classic, Don't Worry, Be Happy. I believe that might be appropriate right at the moment. Nadia didn't answer him. She just sat there frowning as she looked up at Sparks. No? Perhaps a rendition of Funky Cold Medina. Nadia's frowns deepened as she leaned a little backwards.
The funky what?
No, no, Sparks said as he waved one huge robot hand in the air before the girl. Perhaps that's too inappropriate for someone your age. The girl sighed as she wiped tears away from her cheeks.
No thanks.
She finally said.
I don't want to hear music, even inappropriate music. Not that it matters. The world is dead.
Not exactly, Sparks said. As I have said, my scans have detected no human life in over a century. However, my range of scanning is limited, and beyond that range I have no idea what became of the world or what might be alive in it, as I have never left this chamber. You all are my priority. All I can assure you is that the radiation levels have dropped drastically beyond the chamber door. They oddly did that about 4 centuries ago for some reason. As Sparks finished saying that, he looked up at the darkened ceiling above them, tapping one metal finger against the side of his left cheek as if thoughtful. Very odd. I haven't been able to figure that one out or explain it. Yet. Sniffling, the girl stood up to face the huge robot.
What day is it?
It is June 23rd, 3005, Sparks replied, at 11:46 in the morning to be exact.
I'm 900 years old? 10-year-old? You've never left this chamber.
I have had no need to, Sparks replied. You and the other chosen are my priority. Nadia sniffled as she looked around the dimly lit room.
Where's the door?
She expected the robot to refuse to show her, maybe try and warn her against leaving, but to her surprise, Sparks turned to the side and pointed over to the far wall. Nadia scuffed her way over there. Her legs felt stronger now, and she was less dizzy. The door was huge, a massive vault-like door with a large rectangle security-like panel beside it. After staring at that for a moment, the girl lifted her right hand up and placed the palm of it onto the panel, but nothing happened. She then tried to push on the door, but it felt as solid as a mountain wall. Locked. You can't open that, Sparks explained as he stood there watching the girl try to push the door open, to which Nadia replied,
Well, who can?
Sparks walked over to the door and placed one huge hand against the electronic panel, which instantly lit up, and with a loud bang and then a groaning sound, the door opened.
Well, I guess that answers that.
Nadia muttered. For a moment she stood there looking down the dark tunnel as damp, musty-smelling air flowed around her. I would warn you against leaving, Sparks said, but I can tell that won't stop you. Nadia looked back at him, but said nothing. Looking back down, she wondered what she might find on the other side of that doorway. Was the world still out there, or was it all ash and dust? The only way to find out, she thought. Have fun storming the castle, Sparks called from behind her. The girl paused and looked back at the huge robot as he stood in the open doorway behind her. That's from an old movie, Sparks told her. If you return from your walk, I can show it to you on the data pad I have. The girl made no reply to that, other than nodding her head before turning forward and started walking. The hallway was mostly dark and damp. The air smelled moldy, but she noticed that beneath that she almost thought she smelled a flowery scent. The ground was solid beneath her feet, but in some places there were puddles of water, and still in others she felt as if she was walking on thick carpet, which she assumed was from previous experiences in survival camp, was moss or some plant-like that liked to live in wet, dark places. Ahead of her was a swath of oval-shaped yellow light, which she guessed was the entrance, so she walked on toward it. When she finally reached that opening, she came to a stumbling halt and gasped aloud. The hallway she had been walking down opened on the high side of the mountain that had once overlooked Richmond Theater and the small town of Tranquil Lake. And like she had feared, both of those were gone, but not in the way she had expected. What was below her was not the ashes of a destroyed city and abandoned town. What she was looking down at was the lush green roof of a dense forest. The remains of some taller buildings and structures could be seen sticking up above the tops of trees, reminding her of the way the ruins of a lost city that had been swallowed up by the jungle had always looked in movies. Nadia could not believe her eyes, and for a moment thought that she was dreaming.
This can't be real,
she whispered to herself. It certainly didn't look right to her. From what Sparks had told her, there had been a nuclear war, so why was there a forest down there? And birds flying around in the sky? The sky above wasn't a burnt scarce of twisting storm clouds, but blue, with wisps of white clouds drifting across it. In the east, the late morning sun shone brightly. Then she recalled that Sparks had told her the nuclear bombs had fallen almost 1,000 years ago. So maybe that explained it. Maybe enough time had gone by for the world to heal. A long time. That thought made her think of her dad, and everything that had once been. Everything that she had known before the robots had turned bad and tried to kill everyone. The world that had once been and was forever gone. The confusion on her face quickly turned to sadness, and tears began to fall down her cheek. She could not accept that both her parents were gone, and that she was here alone. Alone in an unknown, new world where she didn't want to be. When her tears were spent, feeling numb and empty inside herself, Nadia stood back up and walked slowly back to the lab. Sparks greeted her as she entered. "Welcome back! That was a short walk. Would you like to watch that movie I mentioned before?"
No, thank you,
Nadia said as her eyes drifted over to where the cryopods stood. Row after row of glass tubes and neat little rows. Slowly she walked over to them, going down the rows, seeing the faces of those sleeping within in the frosty glass. She recognized some of the faces, friends that she had spent time with at survival camp for many summers. Others she didn't recognize, especially some of the adults sleeping in their cryopods. She had no idea who most of them were. Sparks walked slowly and silently behind her.
What's wrong with them?
She asked as she turned to face the robot.
Why aren't they walking?
It's not time yet, Sparks replied.
What do you mean?
Your cryopod malfunctioned. You were brought out of stasis early, Sparks told her. Nadia stood there blinking her eyes up at the robot for a long moment before asking.
How early?
15 years.
15 years?
Nadia repeated after a long moment of just standing there looking up at Sparks. I would give you the exact time on how early, Sparks remarked, as he tilted his head to the right, studying the girl. But I can tell by my scans of you that it would only make you more upset than you already are. Sighing, the girl looked around at the people sleeping in their cryopods.
No one will wake for 15 years?
Yes, Sparks replied. They are due to awake in the year 3020, as Dr. Wu set the date for that. She just stood there, looking around at the pods for a long moment.
Alone for 15 years? All by myself?
You are not alone. We are together, and here to look after those still asleep. Together, we'll figure the rest out. Nadia thought about that for a long time, trying to understand what he meant. Look after those still sleeping. He was asking her to help him keep the other chosen safe. Finally, she nodded her head as she glanced around, and as she did so, she noticed another pod in the second row behind her. The glass on it was broken. She frowned at first, thinking it was hers, but then she recalled her pod had been closer to the front of the room. Slowly she walked over toward it, asking,
Was this another malfunctioning pot like mine?
"Correct," Sparks replied.
Where are they now?
"Not here," Sparks replied.
What do you mean?
"He did not return from his walk," Sparks answered.
Sparks, what do you mean?
Nadia asked.
When did he go on his walk?
321 years, 1 month, 3 weeks, and 42 minutes ago, Sparks replied. Nadia arched her eyebrows up at that and said the only word to enter her mind, that was simply,
Really?
She had actually meant that as a typical sarcastic remark and not an actual question, but the robot answered anyway. "Really?"
If I doubt he's still around.
the girl muttered as she looked back at his pod. She never would have imagined hearing a sentinel be nice to her, not after what she remembered robots like Sparks doing to people. Then again, none of the robots she had known before she had gone into her cryopod had tried to be funny and cheer her up, or offer to sing to her. None of the sentinels back in the old world would care enough to spend 1,000 years looking after all these sleeping children and adults and making sure they were safe. But Sparks had. Suddenly feeling tired, Nadia walked back over to the cot, the original one Sparks had suggested she rest in earlier, and sat down on it as she thought over her situation. The old world was dead, all those she had known beyond this chamber. Her father, uncle, everyone dead. But a new world was growing out there. She had seen it herself, and as she thought about it, she looked over at the cryopods with the sleeping children and the adults in them, and wondered what that new world might be when everyone woke up in 15 years. Thinking these things and much more was exhausting, and eventually Nadia fell to sleep. Outside the gates of the ruins of Richmond Elementary, a buzzing sound could be heard. Tick, tick, tick. Possible threats found. Continuing scanning procedure. The Guardian scanned for threats as it had been for the past 1,000 years. The robots had been programmed to hibernate, to preserve their solar power once they had found no threats. This time, though, while the scan did not pick up any human life, something was different. The result, rather than coming back as "no threats found," came back as "inconclusive." The robot did not put itself in hibernation. Instead, it remained alert, and after a short while began performing a grid search, patrolling for what had disturbed it. When Sparks had told Nadia that she was suffering the effects of prolonged cryosleep, she had assumed that had just meant being weak and dizzy. However, when her rumbling stomach awoke her, and she felt the cramping feeling in her belly, she knew all too well, she realized there was more to it than she had first thought. Sparks, who was at his core a medical robot with detailed files that would make an archive computer in an old medical university envious, was standing over her as she sat up. Understanding the huge robot simply said, "Down that hallway," as he pointed to the narrow doorway behind her. The bathroom was almost 1,000 years old, but Sparks had kept it up and in repair over all that time. Well, as best as he could. There was only one working light in there. Parts of the old drop-down ceiling had fallen away to reveal concrete and steel beams beneath, and the white-tiled walls had a yellowing tint to them. None of that really mattered to her. She hadn't come in here to enjoy the scenery and ambiance. Her personal business out of the way, when she returned to the main lab area, she saw Sparks walking down a row of cryopods, holding up that iPad-like datapad he had told her about earlier. As she watched, he would pause before a cryopad, lean down, and look at the readout on the screen on the side of the pod, stand back up, tap on the datapad, and then move to the next pod, and all while singing softly to himself, "Sweet dreams are made of these. Who am I to disagree?" Weird, but at the same time the girl realized that Sparks was checking on the pods to make sure they were functioning properly, and those asleep inside were healthy. Nadia scuffed back over to her cot and found a bottle of water sitting on it. "Drink!" Sparks told her. "It is important to replace your fluids." Nadia lifted up the bottle. It felt cool in her hand. After a second, she twisted the top off and took a sip. That felt so good. So she drank half the bottle before she realized it. When she paused, she looked over at the robot again, watching as he paused beside another pod and leaned down to look at the person sleeping within. "This boy here has an unusual sense of humor. I believe he and I will get along perfectly." Nadia took one last gulp of water and then put the cap back on. Looking back at the robot, she suddenly asked,
You check up on us while we're sleeping?
"Constantly," Sparks replied.
I can't imagine how many times you've done that over and over. Long time we've been asleep,"
Nadia stated. "I could give you a round number if you like," Sparks said as he straightened up and looked back at her, "but I'll just say I have done it twice a day since the Chosen went to sleep." Nadia arched her eyebrows up at that.
Twice a day?
"Correct," Sparks answered. "Unless the system alerts me of a problem, as it did with you, I check on the stats of each pod once in the morning at 0900 hours and once in the evening at 2100 hours." Nadia hadn't realized that she had been asleep that long, yet she still felt tired, so she sat down on her cot, watching Sparks for a moment.
Thanks for the water.
"You're quite welcome, Nadia." Nadia laid back down and closed her eyes as she listened to the robot moving around the pods singing "Sweet Dreams" as he checked each one and recorded his findings in the data pad. As had happened to her before, she drifted off to sleep without realizing it. The next morning, Nadia opened her eyes and was startled to find Sparks standing over her holding another bottle of water. "Good morning," he said in an overly cheerful tone. She recalled radio announcers from 1,000 years ago using, "It's sunny and a pleasant 70 degrees outside. Radiation levels are nominal, and by that I mean low, and there is absolutely no traffic, but watch out for those chickens, they sure can be nasty. Now, if you don't mind, I will now scan your vitals."
You're so weird sometimes, Spark,
the girl remarked as she stretched out on her cot. "I am a conscious robot who has been alone for almost 1,000 years with nothing but old books and movies to keep me occupied, when I'm not checking up on all of you," Sparks replied. "You need food and water. Here." He finished holding the bottle of water out to her. Nadia rolled her eyes at the robot as she sat up and took the bottle of water.
Thanks,
she said as she took a big drink. Then a thought occurred to her.
Is there a lot of supplies here?
"There was," Sparks said.
Was?
Nadia asked as she looked up at him.
What do you mean, was?
"The previous child, whose cryopod malfunctioned, was here for almost 30 years. He went through most of the supplies during that time," Sparks explained.
Ate all the food?
Nadia yelled. "Most of it, yes," Sparks said. "He really didn't go out much to explore. Mostly he stayed by the desk and read books and ate. When I had remarked that he was getting a little heavy, he called me some rude names." Nadia frowned at that.
Well, that was rather rude of him.
"Indeed.
What's left of your supplies?
A few MRE meals and 2 cases of bottled water," Sparks told her.
Shiitake mushrooms?
Nadia said, as if cursing as she thought that over. "No, we don't have any of those in stock," Sparks said. The girl ignored him as she looked over at the cryopods with the sleeping children and adults in them. A few dozen MREs and a case of bottled water wouldn't get her beyond a few days to, well, maybe 2 weeks if she stretched it. After that there was nothing, she realized, and when all these people woke up... "I have something for you!" Sparks' voice snapped Nadia from her daze.
Uh-huh, what?
she asked as she walked over to the robot. He was holding in a familiar crate.
Thank you.
Nadia reached for the items, her eyes suddenly filling with tears as she sat down thinking to the day she had received this crate. Her mind could not wrap itself around the idea that so many years had passed.
Okay, I need to make a plan,
she said as she tried to make her voice sound confident. She took the items out of the crate and spread them out. The crate had been issued to every child and came with the same supplies: a small handgun, ammo, a small knife, first aid kit, and a change of clothes. Each child had been allowed to also pack some personal belongings. Nadia sighed heavily as she saw the familiar colors. She gently traced her fingers over the items. She pulled out each item and set it on the bed. Then she saw the pocket camp.
There's no way this still works,
She said as she picked it up and turned it on. She heard a familiar sound, and her jaw dropped open as she watched the screen turn on.
That's impossible.
Nadia forgot where she was for a while as she played with all the options on her device. The grumbling in her stomach soon reminded her of more important things. She was hungry. She could go get one of the few remaining MREs, but decided to leave that for now. She might need it later on. Instead, she packed her backpack with a few things, including one of the protein bars she had snuck and hid in her personal belongings all those ages ago, and decided to go out and explore and see what she might find. "Where are you going, Nadia?" Sparks wanted to know.
Out for a walk.
"Oh, dear," Sparks said in a somewhat worried tone. "Will this be one of those walks like the other boy took that will last forever?"
No, I'm just going to look around the area, see if I see anything useful out there, and the others might be able to use when they wake up.
The girl replied. "Oh, well, of course, that makes sense," Sparks remarked, sounding relieved. "Just remember."
I'll know. I'll be careful.
Nadia remarked as she picked up her pocket camp. "Yes, that, of course," Sparks said. "And don't take lobsters from strangers." The girl made no remark to that, just gave the robot a double take, wondering if there was something wrong with him. Turning to the giant vault doors that led to the exit, she lifted up the pocket camp and spoke aloud.
My name is Nadia Lewis. Today is June 24th, 3005. I'm heading out to find food and water. I don't know what is out there, but I know I'll never find out if I stay in here. And when everyone else wakes up, we're going to need to eat and drink.
She switched the device off, clipping it to the front of her backpack strap so she could keep it handy. She held her head up high and walked out the door, pausing as her eyes adjusted once again to the brightness of the sun when she had reached the doorway. Once her eyes had adjusted, she hunted around until she found a path that seemed manageable and made her way down into the valley below. She had walked for not long, maybe a few hundred meters. Every step she took, she felt more sadness overtake her. There was nothing but ruins left. Stone blocks that had once been buildings, foundations of what might have been stores, the rusted and brittle skeletons of a bus. Most of what she thought might be the remains of homes or shops were overgrown with brush and vines, and everywhere trees had grown. That, she thought, was a good thing, in a strange way. The human world might no longer be, but the forest and the wildlife that had lived in it seemed to have thrived and taken over everything and everywhere. There were birds singing in the trees, which oddly dampened her fear and sadness a little. And one time, while crossing a narrow stream, she saw a deer and her fawn. Neither of them seemed frightened of her, and she walked very close to them. "That's because they have never seen a human before," she reminded herself. "They have no fear of people." Shortly after passing the deer, she realized that she might get lost, so she decided to leave markers behind, as she had been taught from her previous stints in survival camp. This way, she would be able to find her way back. On top of that, she took a pad out of her backpack and took notes of the largest visible landmarks around her, and even began sketching out a drawing of a map to follow just in case she might need it later on. She, or anyone else. When she came to a broken highway, she sat at the edge as she looked at all the destruction that had occurred to the city ages ago, now slowly being swallowed up by the forest, and felt sadness again.
People used to say that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Not me. What I found was depth, despair, and loneliness. I can only describe as darkness, with the taste of agony.
Not long after this, Nadia came upon the remains of what she assumed must have been that old base camp the Resistance had created to defend the Chosen against the machines. Well, at least one of them. She recalled there had been a few. This old camp was in one of the few remaining parts of the old city that had not been totally swallowed up by the forest. As she explored, she saw some of the taller buildings still standing, although they looked damaged, either by time or the nukes. There was one area that seemed as if the resistance fighters had set up a field hospital or clinic to care for the wounded. When she had gone inside there, she had found some cots and hospital beds still as they had been when the bombs had fallen, although some of them looked moldy and water-stained, but the building looked intact. Then she saw the skull sitting in the corner between a pair of old boots, and she screamed and ran out of the building. Once out in the weed-choked street, she silently cursed herself for acting like a scared little child. There was no time for that now. She needed to be strong, so she explored a little more. On the far side of the area was a strange old iron building with what looked like a huge oven in it. And in the center of all of this was the old Richmond Theater, which after she explored it, she found it to be in fairly good living condition. This despite the war with the machines that had raged in the city and the amount of time that had gone by. Those survival camps had taught her a lot, and because of that an idea began to form in her mind. She took out her notebook again and sketched a map of the area, and then when she felt it was starting to get late, she made her way back to the lab, following the landmarks she had left behind to guide her back. Sparks greeted her as she entered the lab. "Welcome back!" Nadia just nodded her head at him as she walked over to the desk and sat down in the chair behind it, thinking of all she had seen. Eventually, Sparks came over to her and dropped one of the MREs on the desktop. "I suggest you eat. You were out exerting yourself without having had anything of any substantial nutrients in you," he told her. Nadia frowned at that and then picked up the MRE.
"These things are gross,"
Nadia told him as she cut the thick plastic of the MRE open. Nadia went about pulling the contents out of the MRE and eating as best as she could while she thought.
"Sparks!"
She then called when she was eating the dessert that came with the meal. "You rang," the robot replied as he walked over to her.
"You said you have a lot of files and stuff, right?"
"Affirmative."
"You know what I learned from all those survival camps I went to?"
"Not to spit into the wind?" Sparks asked. Nadia ignored him and asked,
"What is the first thing you do when you're lost in the woods?"
"Don't challenge Sasquatch to an arm wrestling match." The girl frowned as she looked up at the robot.
"Dr. Wu programmed you. You have humor. You have to have humor, didn't he?"
"He did. My current humor setting is 75%, Sparks said proudly.
"Can you bring it down to 70 maybe? Because we have some serious stuff to talk about,"
Nadia suggested. "Very well." Sparks sighed as he lowered his head. Humor setting 70%.
"Thank you."
"Knock knock," Sparks said as if he was starting out a knock knock joke.
"Want less?"
"Negative," Sparks replied. "And if I am correct, you are about to suggest that finding running water is the first thing you need to do when lost in the wilderness."
"Affirmative,"
Nadia said with a smile.
"I found a place down there by the old Richmond Dam. There's a lot of water there, which would protect us from the GDI. And by the way, do you know how to build water purification system?"
Sparks straightened up and held his right hand upwards. "I have detailed files on constructing such a thing." Nadia smiled. Over the next few weeks, with Sparks' help and guidance, they collected machine parts, pipes, and other equipment and managed to get the dam up and running, and they constructed a water purification system near the old theater to supply them with clean water source when they were at the base. Finally, on one sunny humid afternoon, all seemed to be set and they were putting the last adjustments on the system.
"I hope this works,"
Nadia said to Sparks.
"When all those people wake up, they're going to need water. And this will be the only thing they have to get it if it works."
"I am confident it will," Sparks told the girl.
"Hope you're right."
"Hey, Nadia."
"Yes?"
A horse walks into a bar and orders a drink. The bartender turns around, takes one look at the horse and says, "Hey, buddy, why the long face?" Nadia bit her lips to keep from laughing out loud. When she was sure she wouldn't, she asked,
Sparks, what's your current human setting?
68%, the robot replied.
Want to drop that down to 50?
Negative, Sparks replied. Water filters are all adjusted. I suggest we give it a try. When they first turned it on, the system shuddered, coughed, and seemed as if it would shake itself apart. However, this only lasted for a few moments, and then it began to run smoothly, the pumps pulling water up and shunting it through the system, eventually filling up the tank. All systems running normally, Sparks said as he stood beside the machine. I would suggest waiting a day before we test the water to see if it can be consumed. It is best to let the filtration system clean itself out first. After that, I will test it to see if it is clean and free of any radiation.
Sounds perfect.
The water system they had built was working perfectly, actually better than expected. The water, clean and free of bacteria, salt, and radiation. Nadia actually filled up a large tub with the fresh water they had made. Sparks had found the tub and took it into the Richmond Theater and hid it in the corner so she would have privacy before filling it up with water. And Nadia took her first real bath in a very long time, while Sparks stood off behind a corner of the theater and scanned the area for any threats to the child. The tank filled back up with fresh water even before the girl had changed into a fresh, clean clothing. Refreshed, feeling satisfied with what they had done, Nadia sat at the desk in the lab, that evening munching on some wild fruit that she had foraged from the forest before her bath, while she wrote about the water system the two of them had built, adding in a note that it will be important to maintain the water system in order to have clean drinking water, and in big letters leaving a reminder to herself and whoever read the notebook to change the water filters every week on Thursday. She then wrote beside this that Sparks knew how to make the filters out of charcoal and the fabric from the suits that they had been in while in cryosleep. Over the course of the next 2 years, as with the water system, Nadia and Sparks refitted the clinic as best they could, in the event that when others woke, they needed it. Thankfully, Sparks had removed that old skull and the dirty old soldier's uniform she had seen upon first entering it.
I have a feeling that I might spend some time here,
Sparks remarked after they had completed their initial work on the clinic, managing to hook up a lighting system, putting clean beds inside it, and even a tub for washing.
That might not be a good thing,
Nadia commented. Why? Not all visits to your friendly neighborhood medical bot have to be a bad thing.
Yeah, maybe they will visit here and some of your jokes,
Nadia suggested with a smirk. Nadia thought that over and nodded her head, understanding the truth in it. She then turned and followed after the robot, shouting.
Think we should start on the garden now?
They did. Nadia had been collecting the seeds to various plants that she had found in the forest, such as berry bushes, wild cabbage, and pumpkins, among a few others. She had also had the luck of finding several old packages of vegetable seeds in what she had guessed was an old garden shop. Tomato seeds, lettuce, carrots, and among others. Sparks had looked them over and announced that most of them would probably grow into plants and produce food if cared for properly. This had led the two to build a modified greenhouse on the far side of an old warehouse where they eventually began growing vegetables, some of which Nadia ate. Well, she ate a lot, actually, but she did with Sparks' help to learn to preserve and can some of the produce and stored them in crates at the warehouse. She had had the good sense of mentioning this in her notebook, which she had decided to leave on the desk in the lab, just to be safe. She had also mentioned that she had collected a lot of fresh seeds from these vegetables and had locked them in an old locker in the warehouse to keep them safe. This locker had a silly picture on it, which Sparks had drawn on the door, so she would know which one the seeds were kept in. On the outside of the greenhouse they had built, Nadia had planted a few apple trees, understanding that it would take years for them to grow and mature before they would bring forth fruit. She guessed that would probably be around the time that the others were waking. An apple a day will not keep my jokes away, Sparks remarked once the apple tree seeds had been planted.
No, but me asking you to turn your humor setting down will.
Nadia told the robot. You wouldn't do that to me again, would you?
No, I don't think I will do that,
Nadia replied. About 2 months later, as summer was turning to fall, Nadia had gone out on one of her exploring missions. She had done several of these over the years, exploring beyond the base camp she and Sparks had built around the old theater, going deeper into the old ruins of destroyed city and scavenging for whatever she could find. Tools, old clothing that hadn't molded or decayed, pots, pans, knives, everything and anything that she thought might be useful to the others when they woke up, she would take back and store them in the base. On this day, a gray, chilly day, through which misting rain fell, she had been hunting around an old, partially destroyed strip mall she had stumbled over. The place was half flattened by time, trees going right out of the shops that no longer had storefront windows or signs telling the world their name. In one of these shops she found a pair of boots that looked as if they might fit her, but when she tried to put one on her right foot, it totally fell apart as if it had been made from ash. Annoyed with that, she had cleaned the stuff off her foot and slid her original shoe back on. She was growing, as Sparks had often hinted at, and her original clothing was getting tight and uncomfortable. Not to mention that her sneakers didn't smell like a rose garden, but were getting tight and uncomfortable to walk around in. She had just stood back up and was going to look around to see if there were other shoes or boots in the store when she heard a commotion coming from the back room of the store. Startled, Nadia spun around to face the noise as she dropped down on one knee. Her rifle was up to arms in the blink of an eye, and she took aim at the light doorway the sounds came from. An instant later, a deer rushed into the room and ran right by her, not even noticing her, as it raced through the store and leapt out what had once been the store front window. After a moment the girl stood up, wondering what had startled the animal. Cautiously she stepped over to the back doorway, leaning against the wall, listening for a moment before finally peeking around the doorframe. Through the open back door of the store she saw something large and steel gray in color moving through the brush. Eventually she caught full sight of it when it crossed an opening between a bush and a trunk of a tree. A guardian! She clenched her jaws, not so much out of fear as it was from anger at the sight of the killing machine. She felt a sudden hate for it, but that hate did give way to fear, and she suddenly realized it could scan the area for life forms, and if it did that to the store, it might find her. Slowly, she leaned back against the wall, and while trying to make as little noise as possible, she loaded a round into the chamber of the rifle. That done, she fell still, listening to the sounds of the machine as it moved outside, and when the noise of it moving and walking slowly faded, she moved quickly in the opposite direction. She made it out of the store and through the woods for a short distance, using the trees and brush for cover, but twice she had to duck and hide as the machine seemed to suddenly walk in her direction. She had no idea yet if it could sense her or not. Oddly, one time when she was hiding behind the trunk of a very large tree, as the guardian approached her, it paused, made an odd ticking sound, and then turned around and walked in another direction. That didn't mean it didn't know she was in the area. It might have sensed her movements or body heat, but when she had hid, it had lost her, and so off it had gone to search a new area, or so she thought. After waiting a good 10 minutes, Nadia moved again, heading down a brush-choked hill and around the crumbled remains of an old building, partially overgrown with brush and vines. Beyond this was a wide clearing through which a narrow stream flowed, and just as she was about to cross it, she heard the robot coming back in her direction. Quickly, she glanced around for a hiding place, but there was none. She was in the open. Suddenly, she heard the babbling of the nearby creek. Running water! The machines could not detect human life through water. Their scanners couldn't penetrate it, especially running or moving water. This is why the dam was a safe place for everyone to live, at least until the GDI was defeated. Tossing her rifle across the creek, she slowly walked into it. The water was cold, but she didn't care. She knelt down and glanced over to her left and saw the robot come out of the forest and enter the clearing. Before its head turned in her direction, Nadia took a deep breath and totally submerged herself under the rushing, ice-cold water of the creek. Just as she went completely under, the robot turned its head towards the creek and stood there for a long moment, as if waiting for something. Eventually, it turned its head away, and for a short moment walked in a circle before finally heading off back the direction of the stores. No sooner than it had left the clearing, Nadia sat up, drawing in a huge gulp of air. She had held it for as long as she could, and finally had to take her chances and a breath. Brushing her dripping bangs out of her eyes, she looked around for the robot, saw nothing, and decided she wasn't going to wait a moment longer. She managed to make it over to the far shoreline, retrieved her weapon, and made her way back to the lab safely. Sparks stood there with his back to the girl, listening as Nadia told him of her encounter with the Guardian, while she dried off and changed into dry clothing. "I was afraid of this," Sparks finally said, when she was done talking and had dressed herself. "They can sense you."
How?
"I honestly don't know, Nadia," Sparks admitted, "but they can. They might not be able to see your biorhythms on a scan, but they know you're in the area. After all, you are the only living human in the world, at least at the moment, so they know you're here, and they will keep looking for you." Nadia stood there a long moment thinking about that.
Shit.
She finally said, as her eyes looked over at the cryopods with the sleeping children and adults in them, some of whom were her friends. "Nadia?"
If they can sense me,
Nadia answered the robot.
they're looking for me. They might eventually find this place, won't they?
"That is probable," Sparks admitted.
I can't stay here,
The girl finally said. Sparks made no remark to that, just stood there looking at her.
I can't.
Nadia said again, as she looked at the robot. Only now, after almost 3 years, she didn't see him as a robot. He was a friend, bad jokes and all.
I can't stay here anymore, Sparks. If they follow me here, they'll find them and kill them before they even have a chance to wake up.
"Where will you go?" Sparks asked in a soft tone. Nadia thought for a moment.
We still have a lot of work left to do before they wake up. For now, I'll stay behind the protection of the base and the dam walls.
That said, the girl went about packing her backpack with some food and water, before strapping her pistol to her hips, as well as her knife, and then slung her backpack over her shoulder. "Nadia!"
I have to go, Sparks.
"I understand that, but the sun has set," Sparks told her. "You'll never make it down the mountain in the dark." Nadia thought that over for a short moment.
I either will or I won't.
"I don't like this," Sparks said.
Look at it this way. If I fall off a cliff in the dark and break my neck, they won't sense me anymore. So they'll stop looking for me, and they'll never find this place.
"True, but I don't like it," Sparks admitted.
I ain't crazy about it either, but I have to do this,"
Nadia said as she slung her rifle over her right shoulder and started toward the tunnel.
Lock the vault door behind me.
Sparks sighed. Very well. While the sun had set, the clouds of the day had broken up and drifted off, revealing a beautiful star-filled night sky through which a full moon was sailing slowly across, offering enough light for Nadia to see by, and she managed to make it down into the valley. Katydid sang in the dark, and from there she made her way to the theater without incident. The following morning, Sparks awoke her with his usual knock knock. When Nadia rolled over and looked up, he was standing there holding out a wicker basket with warm bread and some fruit in it. "Good morning! I am happy to see you survived the night," Sparks told her. He set the basket on the floor before her.
Well, sort of.
Nadia sighed as she sat there and twisted from side to side.
I might not survive another night sleeping on the floor. It's as hard as a rock.
"That's because it's made from concrete," Sparks informed her.
Uh-huh.
Nadia grunted as she pulled a roll out of the basket he had brought her and pulled it apart before stuffing half of it into her mouth and chewed.
You baked this?
Affirmative, Sparks replied. You taught me to do it last year, remember? So if it, as the old saying goes, sucks, it's your fault,
It's
she
perfect.
told him. Thank you, Sparks said. I have something to bring up. Do you know that odd building near the Richmond Theater with, as you put it, a really huge oven is for?
Baking really huge loaves of bread.
Nadia replied. Sparks tilted his head to the side. What's your humor setting at, Nadia?
What's it for?
It's for melting metal.
Melting metal?
When the others awake, they might be able to use it.
For what?
Oh, I don't know, Sparks said in a sarcastic tone. Making interesting artwork and bric-a-brac and maybe making armor and weapons. Nadia arched her eyebrows up as she chewed slowly, thoughtfully.
Can we get it working?
With some new parts and a lot of work, Sparks confirmed.
That might work for smaller ones.
She said as she looked up at Sparks.
But not the Titans. From what I recall, they were indestructible.
Not necessarily, Sparks replied as he held up his right index finger.
What?
Quantillium.
Quantillium? What the heck is that? Where are we going to get it? Quantillium.
Sparks stretched out his arm toward her, showing it. Well, right here. Part of my casting is made of it. All of the robots are partially made of it except the Titans, whose armor is entirely made of it. The military discovered this metal years before and kept it a secret. They named Quantillium. I'm fairly certain that if we were to carefully formulate a mix, we could use Quantillium in the forge to make a weapon we can use against the Titans. By the middle of the winter, the forge was up and running, and by mid-spring, with Sparks' help, Nadia had constructed a fortified wall around most of the area, what she now thought of as the Richmond Fortress. On one afternoon, a cloudy one, they were working on one of the outer walls, pushing large boulders and chunks of stone that had once been buildings up to the walls to fortify it, when Nadia had heard what she first thought was thunder. Pausing, she glanced off to the west at the dark storm clouds there.
It'll rain soon,
she remarked as she looked back at Sparks. My spider senses tell me you are correct, Sparks agreed. Last week, when they had finished their work for the day, before Sparks had returned to the lab to look after the Chosen, the two sat in the old Richmond Theater and watched one of the old Spider-Man movies on his datapad. Ever since then, instead of saying his scans detected this or that, he instead said his spider senses.
You know, when this is finished and everyone wakes up, we're going to have to work on fortifying and keeping this wall solid,
Nadia remarked as she looked over what they had constructed so far.
Once the GDI detect us, they're going to attack it constantly, and if we don't keep it up, they'll break through.
No doubt, Sparks agreed. Just as he had said that, there was a loud booming sound from overhead, and something flew like a missile right over the fortress before vanishing. Nadia was so startled by that she threw herself on the muddy ground with a shout. Sparks stood there, as still as a statue, looking up in the sky.
What was that?
Nadia asked as she jumped up and went to get her rifle. Nothing good, Sparks answered. I suggest we get under cover in case it comes back for a second look. The two hid in the theater for the better part of an hour. When whatever that was did not do another fly over their area, the two agreed to separate for the day, with Sparks returning to the lab and Nadia into her new home in the warehouse. One day in early summer, she made a trip back to the lab to check on Sparks and the children. Nadia was confronted by a sentinel who had followed her from just outside her base. Nadia panicked, but remembering from the times that she had been with her dad to shoot at the neck. So she ran and ducked behind a large stone, regained her composure, and then lay on the ground and leaned around the stone. Taking careful aim, she shot several rounds at the robot and managed to destroy it. Believing she had killed the only one, she slowly stood up and started to run towards the lab, and noticed that now there was another sentinel behind it, approaching the wall, and a Titan app. She made it back to the lab where Sparks shut the vault behind her.
Shit!
She curred as she tried to calm herself.
Shit, they found us. That thing flew over us a few months ago.
Probably a drone of some type, Sparks suggested. They might have been watching the area off and on since then.
Because they can sense me. You and the children are not safe with me here.
Nadia sighed. Unfortunately, that is true, Sparks agreed. Now that they know you are actually a living human, they will continue to hunt for you until they kill you. Nadia's eyes looked over to the pods with the sleeping children and adults in them.
And if I stay here and hide, they will attack and kill everyone, even you, Sparks.
Undoubtedly,
Damn it,
Nadia said, and sighed as she looked over at the pods for a long moment. Her friends were among them. Then she looked up at Sparks, who had become her best friend. Sparks scanned Nadia. You have high levels of fear, Sparks said. Nadia did not reply, and instead sat down on a small desk that was there. There was a recording device, and she started to record.
Well,
Was all the 13-year-old girl said.
I guess that's that.
Nadia, Sparks said in a concerned tone, something tells me you're about to do something stupid. Nadia didn't reply. Instead, she walked over the desk and thought for a moment as she glanced between Sparks to the pods and back again. Finally, she turned on the recorder on the side of the computer monitor there and began to speak.
My friends, for the past 3 years, we have tried to help make the world new. Just like my dad asked of me. It is our destiny. I wish I had succeeded so you would find a world worth living for. A world full of brightness and peace, but I could not do this alone. Sparks and I tried, but they found us. I hope that you guys, with your greater numbers, can achieve what we couldn't alone. You must work together and never give up. You can trust Sparks. He's a good robot. Silly and random at times, but he's good. And one of the best friends I've ever had. You're the only family you have now, so look after each other. Defeat the GDI. Live. Make the world new.
After she stopped the recording, she stood up. Once more, she looked at all her friends. She then grabbed the explosives and stuffed them in her backpack, then grabbed the detonator. She turned and walked over to Sparks, who she had started to feel quite attached to, and hugged him. Don't do this, Nadia, Sparks said in a sad tone.
You know I have to,
she told him.
I have to try to lead them away. If I can't do that, I have to destroy them one way or the other.
After breaking away from her embrace, she looked up at him and said,
Take good care of them, Sparks.
With that, she walked outside the door and looked back at her friend.
Sparks, lock this door and never open it unless everyone else is awake.
I will do as you say, Nadia, Sparks said in a sad tone, but I have to say, this sucks. Nadia nodded her head at him.
Goodbye, Betty.
Goodbye, daughter, Sparks almost whispered, and then reluctantly closed and locked the vault door, and then rested his head against it and remained like that for a very long time, grieving for her in his own way. I will tell them all about you and what you did for them, Nadia. Nadia took a big breath and straightened herself up, feeling confident as she slowly walked down to the edge of the cliff. She looked at everything down below. Richmond in ruins, an even tranquil lake, and of course the GDI who had gathered just below her. She thought back to the great time she had with her parents. Their trip to Disney, where they had bought the Tomorrowland pin her dad had given her on the day they said goodbye. She thought back to the wonderful time she had at RSC, the wonderful adventures she shared with all her friends, Dino Camp, Jedi Camp, Zombie Camp, which were among her favorites. One last time she looked behind her shoulder and thought of the children just inside the bunker. She closed her eyes, holding the detonator tightly in her hand, and after one last breath, she jumped. Her target, the robots, just below her. The end. Whoa! I'm crying.
Wow.
My eyes aren't wet. Your eyes are wet.
My eyes are very wet.
Yeah, our eyes aren't wet. Are your eyes wet?
So they're probably wet.
No! I was really hoping that she would get to see the letters from her dad.
Yeah.
Man.
Well, we don't know. Maybe she will. Put us your theories down below. What you think will happen to Nadia?
Yes, post your theories down below. I don't know if
Yeah.
this is the last chapter or if there's going to be another release between now and the 20th of June. It is the 13th
I
of
think
June.
there might be.
So,
I think there might be.
we will keep you guys posted. Until the next time, you are the chosen. Remember that.